So hello everyone, my name is Mike Fitzmaurice. I am what we call in the business an enterprise technology strategist for portals and collaboration technology at Microsoft. I've spent time, I've been involved in SharePoint technology since before it was called SharePoint. Back when it was Polar and Tahoe, that's when I started with this stuff. The prerequisites, I kind of already said this, but now we're officially on the clock. For those of you that just walked in, ideally you attended the first of the two deployment and administration sessions, but it's not necessarily a requirement because this is extra stuff. It's a little harder than the other content, but it's really meant to be a two-part session because there's too much to fit in 1 hour's time. That's the agenda for the whole thing. So in other words, in the previous session, we talked about new stuff. We talked about farm topologies and shared service providers, which is good. I'm assuming you know what those are. We talked about the database architecture. We talked about administration models. I'm going to talk about technology that involves planning and deploying solutions in, well, different kinds of scenarios. Global deployments, in terms of how you can centralize everything, how you can deal with it in a regional fashion if necessary. Distributed sites and so on, not a problem at all. We'll talk, I shouldn't say it's not a problem, I should say we're going to get straight to it. Capacity planning, I will talk to you about high availability and disaster recovery, but we have a dedicated session on that, so if that topic interests you, I strongly encourage you to check that out. Finally, we'll talk about multi-farm topologies and deploying content from one location to another, dedicated session on that. And we'll talk about solution deployment. There was a dedicated session on that in the last week, which, who was here last week? Is anyone like a double play, like, great, dude, you should get an award or something. You are a dedicated man. Were you doing SharePoint stuff last week? You were. Fantastic. How were Ted and Patrick? Were they good guys? Good. Ted Pattison, Patrick Tissigam, the dynamic duo of SharePoint training. Between the two of them, they have both sides of the Atlantic Ocean covered. And then extranets. We'll talk about firewall rules and a few other fun details. So what I want to spend some time on right now are the management models. And I can imagine full well that in many cases you work in organizations or work with organizations with a strong central IT department. In other cases, you've got an IT administration model that's very regionalized. And finally, some of you are involved in what we might call rogue deployments, where there might be some official infrastructure or no formal portal infrastructure going on within an organization, but individual business units or individual locales may have set up distributed solutions for, could be one vertical business function that fits the whole enterprise, but not every function in the enterprise, or it could be several things for one department. I'm loath to call it departmental deployments. For me, I think of it far more along the lines of single purpose. Could be one geographic purpose, could be one functional purpose. Whoops, I went the wrong way. There we go. So let's talk about what we mean by these things. When we say managed and centralized, these are very easy to index, they're very easy to manage. It's very easy to find information, branding it is not really a problem. You're working on one server or one farm. There's a lot of clarity and straightforwardness associated with this. It's a good thing. In a decentralized type of deployment, well, things get a little bit more easy to access because everyone's got a server close by or closer to their location. It's easier to isolate things and make changes in one place that don't take effect everywhere else. That's a plus. You can distribute the administration to a certain extent. You can change the branding based on locale or based on business unit. But it becomes harder to brand everything in a uniform way. You can do it, but it takes more work, that's all. It's harder, but not impossible to search. And it's also harder, but not impossible to browse across everything you've got. By the way, there's a dedicated session on search as well, on dealing with a lot of deployment issues around our search technology. So, in an unmanaged environment, well, you've got plenty of freedom, but the risk of plenty of chaos. So information can be difficult to find, it can be a very inconsistent experience, but for prototyping and showing the value of our technology to people that weren't necessarily thinking of it in a top-down fashion, these are conditions that can probably be tolerated for a period of time, but probably not forever. Here's an example of a WAN acceleration-based solution to accommodate a central deployment scenario. In fact, I highly recommend doing this. And even in this particular case, we have one site in Redmond. Thought that was a laser pointer button, but I'm mistaken. All right. We had one site in Redmond and one site in Beijing, and we rely on our WAN to take care of all requests. They're facilitated through one central farm. Search happens in one place. The directory of sites happens in one place. We have tens to thousands seconds performance boost thanks to local WAN accelerators. We take advantage of that. There are a number of companies that are involved in doing this. Some of them are, in fact, here on the exhibit floor. Essentially, caching and compression techniques are what get used here in order to cut down on latency. You can also use replication to do this, and there are partners that provide this, and in fact, some of them are, in fact, exhibiting here, that will help you with that sort of solution as well. The key here is, it's not SQL Server replication that you can make use of in this case. SQL Server replication is completely dependent on the application being replication aware. There are extra columns in all the tables that indicate the source of the data. The data has to be either synchronized or transactionally pushed whenever there's an update. It's just out of the scope of the way SharePoint technology works, I'm afraid to say. I'm not afraid to say it, but I regret to say it. If your question is immediately about this subject, I will answer it. If it's on a different subject or even somewhere off my train of thought, I'm going to ask you to wait till the end. What do we do? What are our plans for doing replication? It's just a little too early to talk about what we have in mind for Office 14, as we call it. But you should be hearing a lot more information about what the goals are and the plans for Office 14 in public forums, probably the first half of 2008. That's when we'll start talking about it. What I will tell you is that you can find out more if you talk to your Microsoft representative, if you sign a non-disclosure agreement. We have a very preliminary list of futures information we can share, but just not in public settings. So talk to your Microsoft rep. If you don't know who that is, talk to me afterwards. I will hook you up. But we do want to be a whole lot more serious about global deployments. We do want to be a whole lot more serious about formal build, test, deploy scenarios for everything, isolating applications, all sorts of fun things. How about this? I'll say that a lot of what we're doing is necessary to make Office Online go up several notches in terms of functionality. Use your imagination as to what that would require. I do want to be more forthcoming. I'm just not allowed to do it yet. I apologize. All right. Internally, we at Microsoft in our IT department make use of WAN accelerators, and we don't do any replication. And it works for us pretty darn well. Our WAN isn't the fastest WAN in the world, but certainly not the slowest WAN in the world. And for retrieving documents and browsing pages and executing page code and whatnot, it actually does rather well. About the only complaint I have about our WAN is if you want to copy multi-gigabyte virtual PC images from one end of the globe to the other, that takes a really, really long time. We're optimized for small to medium-sized packets of data, not massive ones. And that's probably perfectly fine. Now, here's a regional deployment that involves optimized network bandwidth, optimized latency. In this particular case, and in fact, this is what we do not for our centralized portals, but for all of our collaboration technology at Microsoft. All roads lead in this particular case to Redmond, to Dublin, or Singapore. And again, I'm just In some cases, the cities are chosen at random. In this particular case, this is really where our data centers are. There's one in Redmond that covers everything in the Americas, north and south, and central. There's one in Dublin that covers the entire Europe, Middle East, and Africa region, and the one in Singapore covers everything in Asia Pacific. We avoid putting things in there as much as possible. If you're trying to figure out where to put, who's got Exchange Server in their organization? Quite a lot of you. All right. Are you, of those of you that are using Exchange Server, are you on 2007 at this point? Fewer of you. How about 2003? All right, we're in good shape. Here's what I would suggest. Look at what you wound up doing with your Exchange servers, and that ought to give you a guide as to where to put your SharePoint farms. It's not exactly the same kind of problem, but it's similar enough that if you start from what you did with Exchange servers, and then figure out where things are different and fine-tune things accordingly, you'll actually be in pretty good shape. At Microsoft, we're actually ahead of the Exchange Server guys. They went from 100 Exchange servers in the 2003 release down to 7 Exchange servers for the entire planet. We've gone from 17 SharePoint servers down to 3. And when I say servers, I actually could mean load balance clusters and so on and so forth, but it's one thing with one server name. We've got 3 of them. It'll give you a good idea of what the network bandwidth loads are going to be if you look at your Exchange server traffic and then multiply it based on the amount of data you expect to have travel over the WAN. If it's more than 200 milliseconds of response time, either increase the bandwidth or create a new location or reduce the network load that other software is responsible for. But the rule of thumb I would suggest is 200 milliseconds. Your performance is going to vary, but I'll give you a couple of crude rules of thumb, and I'm referring to notes just in case. If you've got 1 to 1.5 megabytes of throughput on a T1 line or greater, it'll depend on users, but if you've got response time of under 200 milliseconds, you'll get, let me see, it'll take about 5 seconds or less to load a page over the WAN, and let's see, a 2 megabyte download of a file should take you less than 30 seconds. And those are, in fact, our service level agreements within our WAN at Microsoft, if that helps. All right, this is what we looked like pre-upgrade in Redmond. Now, it's actually an image. I couldn't increase the font on this one. I apologize for that, but the slides are available for download, and you can check it out. But these were where we had a number of, over here on the left, that was our parent portal farm with a series of dedicated index servers and then search servers that did the index gathering. And then there was a SQL Server cluster and so on. There were what we called vanilla or simple direct child farms and custom portal child farms that offered either, plain portals that people wanted to sign up to have IT maintain, but they owned the server, which meant they could put custom code on it if they wanted to. Over on the right is what we did in corporate hosting mode. And those were one set of servers in Redmond, one set of servers in Dublin, one set of servers in Singapore, and actually for a while we had a small set of servers in Japan. Those are now managed in Singapore. But the important thing here is when it made sense, we offloaded certain things for certain pieces of functionality. If you take a look at what we do now, it looks a little bit more like this. Oh, sorry. I should have done that. There we go. Post-upgrade, it's a lot simpler. We've got standard vanilla or simple hosting, some custom portal farms, and then finally, on the internal Microsoft web, we have a couple of front-end servers in each location. It's a fairly straightforward deployment. We make use of common shared service providers across all of these, unless for some reason someone can't do that. So in some cases, we dedicate Excel services directly to specific farms or to specific sets of farms. In other cases, we aren't using Excel services at all because the situation doesn't require it, or we haven't had a lot of demand for it in certain scenarios. And in other cases, we're just getting ready to stage things on Windows compute clusters, in which case we'll go ahead and deploy that when the time comes. But the key is radical reuse of shared service providers and server consolidation. Now here's an example of a branch office type scenario for collaboration. In other words, we still might use centralized portals, but SharePoint Server Search is going to be centralized. So collaboration happens in the trenches, search happens from one location. In general, I don't like to encourage this, but some customers do this and they seem to be happy with it. Every branch office gets a SharePoint server to work on, and of course this could be Windows SharePoint Services or it could be Office SharePoint Server. Doesn't really matter in this particular case. The key is the content's produced and locally managed, but to search across the entire organization, there is a central search server. We do not support indexing locally and propagating the resulting catalog to one central location over a WAN. And this is the limitation here. So you really do have to do one of two things. You can either index in one location and do your index gathering over the WAN and throttle the traffic accordingly so it doesn't consume too much bandwidth, and time it correctly so that it's not competing too much with user requests. And that'll be a different schedule for different locations, of course. Or you also distribute the search functionality, and you take advantage of the new functionality coming out with our search server, or our search services, Microsoft Office SharePoint Server for Search version 2. And I may be wrong about the exact title because we've changed it a couple of times in the past couple of weeks. But I think it's stabilized, and the point is our new search stuff that will come out standalone, including Search Express, and will also be a feature pack to upgrade MOS within a few months. That supports federation. So you could federate multiple search servers in different locations and roll them up into, well, not just in one central place, but you can federate in a cross-connected way across all of your locations, in which case the search query will be issued to every search server and they come back in a set of linked web parts so you can see where the results across the entire planet. And that would actually do the job. So let's talk about deployment and capacity planning, and hopefully that won't happen to you. So here are some setup and deployment hints and caveats. You actually could glean this by reading every white paper we've got, every TechNet article, every blog posting from us and from a lot of other good people out there. But this is stuff we have noticed people forgetting, not noticing, or simply not doing. So we wanted to make a point of making sure that you get this. So first of all, couple things. WFE, I should have spelled that out, stands for Web Front End. When you install SharePoint Server, you have a choice of doing a basic installation or an advanced installation. The advanced is what you would do if you're going to do a farm. Basically, look at it like this. You get to make this choice once. If you want to change it, you've got to deinstall and reinstall. And I admit that's ugly, and on behalf of the team, I apologize for that. What can I tell you? If you do a web front-end installation, it doesn't bring over all of the bits. It brings over only enough bits to operate as a proper web front-end server. It assumes all the shared service provider code will always live somewhere else. Oh, also, the basic installation is going to install the SQL Server Express. It assumes it's a single box type installation. Generally speaking, you want to do an advanced installation, and you don't want to do the web front-end server role. Run it in advanced, and that allows you to point to an external SQL server or a local real copy of SQL Server. If you want those two things or you ever expect to participate in a farm, do that. I would strongly recommend doing that. You can always change it later because you've got all the bits installed on the server together and everything makes sense. If you don't do that, it's harder to make a change. So generally, do an advanced, don't do the WFE role. Let's see, there are 3 key executables here. There's setup.exe, that puts the binaries on the computer. You know what setup is. The key here is, if you run it by itself, you get a GUI, but you can run it from a command line and pass a config.xml to it, and it'll automate the entire thing. psconfig is the thing that connects to databases, manipulates config.db, and so on. It also starts a GUI for configuration purposes if you have no parameters, but again, that's all scriptable. And then finally, STS-ADM is your toolbox. You can do pretty much everything from the command line, including very complex, batch-oriented, scripted operations. In fact, there was a dedicated session on going crazy with STS-ADM. Definitely worth checking out or grabbing the slides if there's a conflict or if it already happened. I forgot when it's scheduled. So, let's see. The central administration console is the lifeblood for you. It actually is a dedicated web application running in the context of SharePoint sites. We are using ourselves to administer ourselves. What we suggest, by the way, when setting up farms is it's a good idea if you've got multiple web front ends to possibly, if you've got enough of them, dedicate one and only one machine for searching. When I say searching, I'm sorry. Dedicate one web front end to be the server that gets pointed to by the index gatherer. If I point an index gatherer at the entire farm, the requests to retrieve data for indexing purposes will be load balanced, and they could hit any server in the farm and so on, and slow down performance across the entire environment. If I say, however, instead of referring to the network load balance cluster, I refer to one specific server, suddenly all the requests go to that box. In fact, if I want to be really clever about things, I will exclude that dedicated web front-end server from the normal load balancing activity and dedicate it to be there for one purpose and one purpose alone, which is to respond to requests from index gatherers. That's actually a really, really good idea. I recommend it strongly, as does the entire team. But I will say that there is a way to configure this from within central admin, and I actually think you should be very, very careful about it because it manipulates host header entries. And how can I put this? If you use it, it may not propagate everything. If you're using multiple host header entries, if you're using a lot of virtual paths and so on and so forth, or if you add a new web front-end server to the environment, a lot of those direct manipulations that happen to web.config or hosts or so on and so forth might not get propagated to the other servers. If it's not metadata that's persisted in the config database, it's not metadata that will get automatically added to a new web front end. So, yeah, I would actually suggest manipulating your load balancing technique directly, and then when you're indexing, point the index at a dedicated web front end, and if for some reason they're going to have different names, use either a site path rule to transform the name into the correct thing, or simply directly manipulate the host's file consciously and deliberately and do it that way. Don't rely on our automated method for doing it. You could call it a bug, you could call it an omission, you could call it a feature, but whatever it is, I'd actually suggest doing it deliberately and consciously. The technique is good. The way it's implemented inside the GUI, I have, well, mixed feelings about it would be putting it mildly. Couple of other things. Yes? Will that change in IIS 7? To be perfectly honest, no, I don't believe so. I think the situation is still around. Besides, as far as we're concerned, it's still, we think it's IIS 6. If you're talking about if it changes in the next release, again, not talking about the next release of Office SharePoint Server just yet. No, we typically do most of our, again, the key here is, if we add another web front-end server to our farm, it fires up, and then the code that we have running on it that implements web front-end technology looks into our config database to make all the local adjustments on that machine. It copies over web part code, it copies over features and solutions, all kinds of good stuff. It really does a good job on a lot of fronts, but direct manipulations you did on a per-server basis, it won't bring those over automatically. Now, if you're doing this to an entire, there are some things you can do in central admin, and it'll properly do them one at a time to every front-end server, but if it's not something that also got stored in our config database, we've got no way of knowing how to manipulate the metabase inside of IIS7. All right, so where was I? Oh, right. Last thing, and I don't have a bullet point on this, but just a couple of things. Realistically speaking, you can deploy SharePoint technology on a single box, and we're happy to do that standing up in a single box deployment. But the minimum number of servers for a fault-tolerant deployment, and I don't care if you're a 10-person organization or a 10 million person organization, fault-tolerant means it needs to be fault-tolerant. It needs to have very little downtime. Exactly how much downtime is okay is really up to you. But the point I need to make here is that you need 5 servers. You need at least 2 web front ends so that you can load balance between them using either our built-in network load balancing or a hardware load balancing technique. They're stateless. Treat them accordingly. You need at least 2 database servers clustered using Windows Server clustering and a SQL Server. Then obviously you want a proper disk array in order to make sure that there's not a single point of failure, at least in terms of disk. If the entire array fails, yeah, but you probably have bigger problems then at that point. And then the 5th machine is a dedicated index gatherer. You only need 1 because in that particular scenario, the web front-end servers are also hosting copies of the index and serving up or answering queries. And that's okay. And they receive propagated copies of the index from the index gatherer. If it dies, there's still copies of the index on the web front ends, the query processors. You stand up another server, you rebuild the index, it repropagates it, and you're ready to go. That's not a problem. But yeah, minimum 5 servers if you want fault tolerance. If you don't need complete fault tolerance, you can get away with as few as 1. Planning for availability. In IT, 2 nines is a single server deployment. 3 nines means at least 2 web front ends and a SQL cluster with database mirroring in the back. And realistically speaking, check and see if your maintenance window is going to count when you decide to sign up for a service level agreement. Because realistically speaking, if you say you need 5 nines, that means you've got 26 seconds of downtime per month or 5 minutes a year. And I'm kind of guessing you need more time than that to apply service packs. We've got features that can quiesce a farm, basically quiet it down, stop receiving new requests so that the activity goes down, and then you can take it offline in an orderly fashion. So we can get you to a quiet spot to do maintenance on the environment pretty readily. If you go for 2 nines, that gives you over 3 days a year, or 7 hours a month, or 14 minutes a day to do maintenance purposes, and so on and so forth. This is just math. But think about it. For capacity planning purposes, we have a number of suggested limits. These appear in TechNet articles, in the product documentation, and so on and so forth. These are not hard and fast limits. There are a couple that are hard and fast, but by and large, these are limits that we figured out through, or limits that we have tested and know to work well. go past this, and you need to test it in your own situation. I'll tell you a couple of these that are hard and fast, but by and large, these are things we worked out. So the key focus here, how about, let's see. I want to focus on, where are we? There we go. 50 megabytes. Where was I? Oh, here we go. Document size. That's scope to a file, and the guideline is you can go up to 2 gigabytes. That's a hard and fast rule. We cannot store something larger than 2 gigabytes inside of SQL Server. It's a blob, an image data type. And in doing that, they can't tolerate anything larger than, actually it's slightly under 2 gigs by a handful of bytes for maintenance purposes. That's our physical limit. We actually have an artificial limit you can apply earlier than that limits the size of an upload, and it's defaulting to 50 megabytes. Within Microsoft, we upped it to 100 megabytes. But you need to make a conscious choice on that, and here's what I mean by that. Think about HTTP timeouts in your environment. Because the two issues you need to think about if you're going to have something bigger than 50 megs are, will the request timeout on upload, and how much RAM do I have? Because the protocols that we have available for accepting an upload are going to buffer the upload in memory. So if for some reason the server is used aggressively for document management and you've got hundreds of users uploading 2 gigabyte files at the same time, we need a lot of RAM, or we're going to do a lot of disk swapping for virtual RAM. And paging is not fun. It's necessary, but it's not always that much fun. So we buffer in RAM until we've got the completed upload, and then we write. So keep that in mind in terms of what you're willing to tolerate. That's the second big reason, in addition to HTTP latency. If we're not just going ahead and saying, I'll accept everything. The other thing I wanted to focus on, if you would, is list size. A lot of these, like I said, are essentially governed by what we've determined to be okay. But here's where I wanted you to pay attention to. Essentially 5 million list items, but 2,000 items is the way to go in terms of what you're viewing at one time. So we can actually tolerate a whole lot more storage than we can tolerate in the way of display. Let me explain. Here's a graph that shows you how our list scalability works. It's actually been improved dramatically from the previous release. This is a flat document library view, and you can see with the total number of documents in the library and the transactions per second, there's a relationship that basically starts to drop pretty readily and completely flatlines at 4,000 and stays bad for the rest of the time. So the bigger the number of things that have to be returned in a request, the worse the performance is. Why does this happen? Because, remember, we optimize for total throughput of the system, not for one list. Total throughput of the system matters. We assume that a SharePoint site deployment is being used aggressively to do a lot of things at once. And as a result, we retrieve everything in the list when you ask for a view of a list, by default. At that point, they do some post hoc manipulation on the web front end to screen out the stuff we don't want. We'll either use XSL transformations, or actually it's camel transformations, in order to either filter or sort or group or cut away a page of data and only show that. But in terms of our interaction with SQL Server, we're grabbing the whole thing. Again, for total throughput of the system, this is actually the right thing to do. Now what you want to do is game the system to make it work for you. And the way we suggest you do that is to use one of two techniques. Indexed views, which are a new feature in 2007, or break things up into folders, which is also a new feature in 2007. Actually, folders were around in document libraries in 2003, but now they apply to everything. And in both of these cases, an indexed view will cut down on the sorting and grouping and filtering. And for that matter, folders cut down on even more. So essentially, look at this. Here's 0 documents. Here's 400,000. Here's 1.2 million. And there's no drop-off in throughput. Folder views are faster because they not only handle the sorting and filtering and grouping. They not only handle sorting and grouping, they also filter. They restrict the retrieval to the contents of just one folder within the list. Indexed views only do sorting and grouping, not filtering. The filtering still happens locally. Now, notice that's still pretty good. But still, folders, not a bad idea, definitely worth your time. I think there are only 2 things that can't benefit from folders. Let's see, surveys, can't do folders and surveys, and threaded discussions, can't do folders and threaded discussions. Every other kind of list in SharePoint land supports folders. I suggest using them in a big, big way. And then roughly 2,000 items per folder. Notice how we start to lose performance at a certain point. 2,000 is when it really picks up in terms of dropping. But in fact, if you can keep it to 1,000 or less in one folder, you're not going to notice slowdowns even if you've got a ton of content in one location. There are other things to think about, but in terms of list scalability, this is the biggest piece of advice I can pass on. And the capacity planning session talks about this in much greater detail. This is a high availability example for capacity planning purposes. It's a 3x1x2 farm, 3 front ends, doing queries and calculations. Here's the index gatherer, and here's a clustered SQL server. In this particular situation, we're using pretty much commodity hardware and so on. We've got 100,000 users. This is like the typical usage. About 100,000 or so site collections of millions of documents, indexing millions of documents. And we're getting the service level agreements of less than 30 seconds to retrieve a 2 meg file, and most requests happen in under 5 seconds. That's 100,000 casual users. Casual users. Heavy users, you're going to want to increase that. No 2 ways about it. So let's talk about high availability and disaster recovery now. I put this up here as an example. It is not a hard and fast rule. I also am not going to go through this right now. I put this in the deck so that you've got it to look at later. This is a decision tree flowchart that works some of the time to help you figure out what you might need inside of your topology. It'll take too long to go through this. In fact, this is what you do for front ends, and this is what you do for SQL servers. And I could get really, really dry and boring and drill down in this for an entire half hour per slide. Let's not do that. I'll talk about some of the key points here in these flowcharts. Go look at these flowcharts in the slide deck later on. For backup and disaster recovery, the option summary looks a little bit like this. For content recovery, we did something for you in addition to something for users. We have what we call a recycle bin. The first stage is for the user, and that's what they see in the normal UI. The second stage is for you. There's an administrator level recycle bin that makes everything available to basically make the threshold longer than the user recycle bin. So things can be auto-rolled out of the recycle bin after a certain period of time, but there's an extra period of time, and it's configurable by you, where you can still grab it out of the administrative recycle bin. What we want to do is cut down on your need to ever go back to backup media. We really don't want that to be necessary if we can at all avoid it. Versioning, turn it on. Turn on versioning. Limit the total number of versions, because every version is an entire copy of a document or a list item or so on. We're not doing differencing, because differencing requires some knowledge of what it is you're differencing, and we don't have that available for every file format possible. So, the one thing that we don't have a recycle bin for is the deletion of a site itself. But that's okay if you go to Codeplex and you search for site, what was it called? We gave it, oh, right, site delete capture tool. Find this under codeplex.com/governance. It's one of the tools Microsoft's IT department has created. It is an event receiver that gets registered that monitors for the destruction of a site, intercepts it, saves a copy of it off by calling the same objects that STS-ADM calls to save off a copy of a file, to back up a site collection or a site. And then it allows the deletion to proceed finally. Use this. You'll find it under codeplex.com/governance. It's called the SharePoint Site Delete Capture Tool. It's actually part of a whole package of tools that it's the governance toolkit or something to that effect. Search, just go to codeplex.com, search on SharePoint and governance, and it should pop up to the top pretty quickly. Snapshots, yes, you can do snapshots, but don't think of them as disaster recovery vehicles. Think of them as being used for a quick restore of the database. You will lose the original source information. Your local diff area is going to be gone. It's not. Don't think of that as a panacea, but it can be useful some of the time in some scenarios. Third-party tools. There are people here on the exhibit floor, the usual suspects, Commvault, AvePoint, Veritas, Quest. They're all worth checking out. They're not exactly the same, but they all have enterprise scaling solutions and manageable solutions for doing clever backup of our technology and other products as well. For disaster recovery scenarios, you can do STS-ADM backup and restore of individual sites and site collections. You can and schedule that in an orchestrated fashion with jobs. You can do SQL Server backups. You can use third-party tools again. Log shipping and remote shipping of snapshots, that actually does a fairly decent job as well. Let me see. SQL backups, however, do not bring everything across. So I'm actually, if you plan for it properly and you don't just assume that everything is being copied over to the remote, the warm standby site, warm standby location, you'll be fine. But the key here is SQL Server backups don't bring along, shall we say, the content, the full text index. That's kept on the file system, and it's a different kind of technology. If you use the SharePoint backup tool or one of our third-party friends' tools, they'll grab the index amongst other things. Some of the technology from, say, DoubleClick and Neverfail and other companies like that, where they're doing packet or block level image replication, that might work actually quite well. That's interesting. It's worth taking a look at. Let's see. Docs are being pushed out about log shipping and site resiliency and database mirroring. All of them can definitely work. All I'm saying is that if you rely on something that only replicates the databases, two things don't come along, and one of them shouldn't come along. You're doing this to the content database, not the config database. The config database is the farm. You'll have two different config databases in two different locations, and there's nothing wrong with that. The second thing is the index is going to be different in two locations, and there's nothing wrong with that either. So this is a warm standby copy receiving log ships. Just make sure that it's standing up, ready to run all the time, and it gets indexed independently, and the farm has its own config DB. Then you use DNS-based techniques in order to redirect people to the other location without them being the wiser. The data protection manager. There's a session on that as well, I believe, in the management track that just came out, and it supports SharePoint sites as well. It's okay for content recovery and disaster recovery scenarios, but not for high availability scenarios. All right, a couple other things when it comes to disaster recovery. Talked about two-stage cycle recycle bins. Sorry about that. I had a couple of notes to myself on this slide. Yeah, pretty much I mentioned everything that's on this slide, but that wasn't this. I wanted to have this so that you could read it later. All right, let's look at a log shipping mirror farm. If you have network load balancing, make sure you're using persistence affinity. Some people call this sticky sessions. I don't care what you call it, use it. It's not well documented, admittedly, but you'll run into it and find it very necessary for filling out forms and filling out surveys. Every time you see multiple authentication prompts, for example, it's probably because you're not using sticky sessions. Okay, there could be other reasons why you're receiving multiple authentication prompts, but even if it's just browser interactions and you're seeing multiple authentication prompts in a forms-based authentication scenario, that's probably because you're not using sticky sessions. So this example involves big IP. It's probably not the right thing for NLB because the Passover farm would be in a different subnet. But still, the principle remains the same. It's comparatively easier to do this with Windows SharePoint services than SharePoint Server, but you can still do it with SharePoint Server. All right, moving on, because this is, again, a grab bag of advanced topics. Let's talk about security and firewalls. We support a flexible authentication method. We're quite happy to accommodate a variety of scenarios. Windows authentication, the normal NTLM or NT challenge and response authentication is the default. And the reason we do this is we wanted you to be successful in installing it with one click without needing necessarily the permission of IT in order to get the right permissions to do Kerberos and so on. We actually recommend, aggressively recommend, strongly recommend, beg you in fact, use Kerberos, unless for some reason you can't. Kerberos is just plain good. It's good for delegated access. It's good for, well, how can I put this? It solves a lot of problems in terms of multi-server interaction, retrieving data from other kinds of content sources. Kerberos is just plain good. It even helps in some extranet scenarios. Well, less so, but still. You need the cooperation of your Active Directory administrators in order to have a machine account that's allowed to participate in a Kerberos environment. So, here, a couple good examples. Our RSS web part, the one in the box we give you for doing RSS retrievals, it's only going to retrieve RSS feeds from other SharePoint sites if you have Kerberos turned on, because we don't have anonymous syndication. And actually, well, if they're non-anonymous sites. The only way we're going to pass your user context from the server with the RSS web part in it to the server that has RSS syndicated lists in it is with a Kerberos ticket. If you don't have that, you're not going to make it. What's the other thing? It has an impact on security, on the business data catalog. If you're not using single sign-on, or basically our credential vault, the enterprise single sign-on technology, make sure you're using Kerberos, and that the things you're connecting to make use of it as well. There are other options with respect to the business data catalog that I will in fact talk about tomorrow, but let's keep going. We support .NET pluggable providers for authentication. I believe we have a lab on that. I've got a summary of all the other relevant related sessions and labs and so on and so forth at the end of this slide deck. But the key here is partners might be using LDAP directories. You might even be using Active Directory as your directory, but you want a forms-based logon for it. Maybe you have SQL Server tables or Oracle tables or something to that effect. We don't have our own custom means of deferring to alternate directories. We use what ASP.NET built for us. Namely, literally member and role providers. You write a .NET component that implements the right interfaces or inherits from the correct classes, and put in the code in order to do the check against whichever thing you prefer. In the box, we'll give you one for SQL Server and for Active Directory with a forms-based logon with Windows SharePoint Services, and Office SharePoint Server ships with an additional one for LDAP servers. But really, write one or acquire one from a third-party vendor, and you should be okay. There are a couple of issues with using this kind of security. Typically, let's see, how can I put this? There are limitations if you're going to use ASP.NET-based authentication technology. The key here is you'll be fine, but they assume everything is a browser. The flaw in forms-based authentication technologies is they assume every HTTP client is a browser. They have no idea what to do if it's a SOAP request or a WebDAV request or a front-page RPC request or any app-to-app traffic, because the technique is to intercept the request, send you a form instead, ask you to fill it out, then you send it back, and then you're either sent back a cookie or you're sent back a munged URL with a session ID inside of it. Problem with that? Office applications, or any smart client of any kind. If you're clicking on a link inside of a SharePoint site that launches another application, like Edit in Microsoft Office Word, at that point, well, Word doesn't have access to that session info. And Word doesn't know how to respond to a page that contains a logon form. It thinks it's a document. Chaos will ensue. It's not a happy thing. What can you do about it? Use persistent cookies to make sure the user logs on to the web-based application with a browser first so they get the cookie, and then they can launch Word out of it and it'll retrieve the documents faithfully and so on. And the persistent cookie doesn't have to be permanent. It just has to be persisted on disk for the life of the editing session or the life of your interaction with the server for a period of time. You define how long it should last. You can have more than one kind of authentication per zone per web application. Zones are entry points into a web application in our parlance. You can have, for example, one zone that points out to the public internet or public extranet, and one that points into the local intranet. And you can have normal AD authentication inside and forms-based authentication pointing to the directory of your choice on the outside, and you can mix the users together in the exact same set of sites and site collections. It's not a problem. We support it quite thoroughly. But again, the forms user has a couple of limitations just because nobody in smart client land has come up with a way to support forms-based authentication, unless for some reason we want to embed a little browser in every smart client. And even then, we need a means to have the smart client know that what it's receiving is a logon prompt as opposed to a block of HTML being sent because it's expecting to edit it or something to that effect. It can be done. We're working on this for future release. We're working with lots of different groups because it requires more than just one team to come to an accord on this. But in the meantime, just be mindful of that. And there is a feature that you can, or a setting that you can do on a per zone basis that disables smart client links. It basically lobotomizes the user interface to take away things like edit in Microsoft Office Word or PowerPoint or what have you. And it treats it just like a browser client thing. If you want to grab a document off of a site where you've turned that feature or turned that smart client integration off, you'll have to download it to your desktop manually, edit it, and then upload it using the browser-based interface. But you won't get links that cause crazy things to happen. So if you do have to do this, either use persistent cookies, and if you can't do that, then at least turn off smart client integration. We have web application security policies, and they're a really good idea in a lot of scenarios. Not every scenario, but enough scenarios that you should know about them. This is another thing we don't see people take advantage of very often. This is a way for you to centrally enforce and overriding permissions. You can do an overriding deny or an override deny right or an overriding full access. So, for example, if I've got a certain group of people that should never, ever, ever go to a series of sites, the example I typically think of for financial or fiscal compliance purposes would be you have investment bankers, you have brokers. By most countries' laws, they're not allowed to collaborate on anything. Well, that's okay. Make sure everybody in the investment bankers group has a blanket deny all on the sites that get used by the brokers and vice versa. Other times you want certain people to have access to everything, like, for example, attorneys. Or possibly, we took away the ability of server administrators to automatically have permissions on every site within a SharePoint deployment. And normally that's the right thing to do, because and if they give themselves those rights, that gets audited and therefore you know about it. But if for some reason you have a business need in order to make sure that the server admin has the right to all the content on the site, fine, do a blanket grant. This is where you would do that. Don't create a policy that involves a deny all on all authenticated users, though. This is cumulative. It affects everybody. The fine-tuning of permissions, those aren't overrides. Those are added. So if you deny all authenticated users, administrators are authenticated users. That would be bad. Other fun little security considerations that are worth rattling off quickly before we move on to a couple of other things. Configure your firewall rules to lock things down to the most restrictive level of usability. Let's see. Be careful with IPsec and network load balancing. It's a good thing to turn it on, but make sure that you're using sticky sessions amongst other things. It can't, make sure if you're turning on IPsec that your Mac and Unix clients have what they need in order to properly interact with us. Careful with Kerberos and network load balancing. Again, sticky sessions help with this in a big way. Don't create a deny policy on all authenticated users. Don't rely on access control lists for partitioning groups of people into particular sites. Your typical user I take that back. If you have self-service provisioning of sites going on, don't expect ACLs to do, or access control lists, permissions on sites, to do all the work. How many people here find that in either a customer or a client, either in your own organization or a customer organization, somebody allowed really sensitive information to be viewed by all authenticated users? Because when they created and provisioned the site, they didn't bother to lock it down. Okay, you in the back and Microsoft are the only companies that have ever had this. I'm assuming no one else wants to admit it or just hasn't encountered it or something like that. It's a very common thing. In very rare cases do users think about, as they create a site, what they want to grant permissions to and who they don't want to grant permissions to. It happens, but it doesn't happen a whole lot more often than it does happen. So think about partitioning things into different site collections or into different web applications, and go ahead and use these security policies. They will help a lot. So there's some other good things. Configure ISO secure publishing, also known as reverse hosting. It's better than router ACLs. Can also set up things like, not everybody agrees with this, but I do believe in 2 DMZs, one in between the farm and the outside world, one in between the farm and the inside. Make sure you're running forefront antivirus and content scanning. For the outside world, at least, use secure communication with trusted SSL certificates. And was there anything else I wanted to make sure of? Make sure that central admin's running inside the DMZ. Some people try to put that inside the firewall completely, or instead of in a DMZ, and it's not that great an idea. Here's an example of an intranet, extranet, internet deployment involving 2 farms and 3 shared service providers. So I have published intranet content, a farm of my sites and a farm of team sites. They're all making use of one shared service provider for search purposes and Excel services purposes and so on. Here's a partner website, which is an extranet scenario, and that has its own SSP. We partitioned it specifically for that. We don't want to assume that the people that have provisioned external-facing sites that are hosted here, we're not just going to let them use the same search engine and expect that all the access control list items here have been set up properly. Because if they are sharing a search engine, yes, that's more efficient, but I'm sure one of these people just assumed all authenticated users would equal all internal users, and it would be perfectly okay to just let that slide. Over here in the partner web, well, someone could do a search and discover the existence of documents with titles and descriptions that the internal people really didn't want someone to see. Even if they click on the link, they won't go anywhere. They'll still see the link in the first place. So don't assume the user locked all the content down. Sometimes, particularly when you're moving between intranet, extranet, internet, use a separate SSP. And then finally, here's the public-facing internet site. And yes, it has its own SSP because we don't even want those people to run the risk of seeing what's inside of a partner website. That's totally anonymous access. All right, so architecture considerations. You might have more than one farm for different service level agreements, different levels of application or customization agreements that you've got. So it might just be a performance thing. It might be a, you don't run any custom web parts, and therefore I have this SLA. You do, and therefore I have this SLA that gives me a lot more leeway to debug and monitor code I don't know about, and so on. Already talked about a good example of isolation. You might have more than one site collection. In fact, you might have a lot of them if you want to have separate delegation of ownership and content types and a whole bunch of metadata and quotas and the ability to split your load across multiple databases or even database servers. In truly large farms, that's an absolute necessity. And you might have only one site collection if you want easy global navigation from us. There are third parties that have created navigation solutions that cut across site collections. If you want inheritance across the board throughout the entire environment easily of master pages and such, you'd have to duplicate the master pages across multiple site collections if you don't have everything in one collection. Security inheritance, content query web parts, those only work within a site collection policies, and so on and so forth. Admittedly speaking, our unit of governance, our easy unit of governance where everything just works out of the box is a site collection. If you want to span site collections, you're going to need some help. You can script it. You can use a third-party tool like Echo for SharePoint. There may be others that I don't know about, but that's what I have to say about that. Oh, from a mirroring perspective, don't go past, this is something that we tested a while back, don't go past 29 content databases. Log shipping, same kind of deal. It's, for clustering purposes, don't go beyond 100 databases in a single instance. It's a manageability thing, basically. All right. I want to cover a couple of other things in terms of database considerations. The config database, for those of you not familiar with this, this contains a list of all known site collections, web applications, web parts, solutions. It's the most critical database in the farm. It is the farm from our point of view. The content database, on the other hand, is there for all the blobs, all the content, all the sites within collections. Most content, actually, to be perfectly honest, the content databases are a perfect candidate for RAID 5. Absolutely perfect candidate for RAID 5. The search database and the shared service provider database, there's a lot of high disk I/O here. It contains configuration for search and the search property store. Optimize that for very, very high disk I/O, as opposed to content databases where what it might need at any one time could come from anywhere across a wide variety of data. Don't forget to budget time and schedule jobs for database management. The moment you get into a deployment of for small things, let the automatic stuff do its job. For large enterprise-grade deployments, you need to run DBCC check database from time to time. You might need to do database shrinking from time to time. In fact, another thing that I can tell you that you should do is fine-tune auto-grow if you're going to use auto-grow, and most of us do, I think. But what is the default? 10%? You might want it to be a larger number than that. So that, because every time you auto-grow the database, it stops, grows it, and then prepares it for extra storage space and so on and so forth. It takes time for an atomic write operation on a database to pause and auto-grow. Let it happen in and fragmentation happens in a bigger way when that happens. And you don't auto-defrag all the time. Those require conscious maintenance efforts. So grow less often. Set the growth level to something bigger, if you would, please. This is secure web publishing with ISA. The goal here is I've got users down here working in whatever client we have available, going through the internet cloud. Here's the DMZ. And here's my Exchange server, my SharePoint server, my internal network, and so on. So if you have integrated security, you've got smart cards and one-time password support, customized logon forms, you might be using LDAP, you might be using NTLM and Kerberos, and you might be using improved idle timeouts for session management. That's if you have integrated security. You can use web publishing and load balance that if you're using ISA. You can use the Exchange and SharePoint publishing tools that ISA now understands how to do. You can use enhanced certificate administration. The point I'm making from this slide, there are lots of things that I can rattle off here, but the main thing is ISA is good and it complements us in a big, big way. Forefront security for SharePoint, I believe there's a dedicated session on this. It protects us because this is particularly important in extranet scenarios where you're collaborating with people and you don't know what they have or don't have on their desktops. You can mandate that every desktop inside the firewall has got antivirus software on it that you trust, but you might still want to make use of this. By the way, since we have pluggable indexes, or not indexes, but pluggable antivirus engines, you can use an engine for more than just checking for viruses. You can actually do auditing of uploaded files as they're uploaded using Forefront security. So if you don't trust some of the people in the extranet scenario to upload things that don't have controversial statements that they just love to make sure shows up on one of your servers before an audit happens, or profanity or what have you, that is another good use of this technology. I want to move, I do actually want to, here's an extranet architecture sample. Here's internet partners, external users and such. Here's an ISA server firewall. We've got web servers. We've got a router, application servers, and a SQL server. And here's the ISA server inside the firewall and CorpNet users coming in. This is what I'm talking about with respect to an extranet architecture. This is content deployment running between multiple locations. So content deployment in this scenario, it's perfectly okay for it to span farms. I've got authoring happening in this site collection, I've got staging happening in this site collection, and then I can do a content deployment job that pushes the content into a completely different farm for production purposes. This is what the web content management technology is designed to do. There are sometimes it works really well, sometimes there have been some known issues with it. We've provided a lot of architectural guidance on that, but the other thing that's happened is look to a lot of this to have been some of the clumsiness in content deployment to be addressed in Service Pack 1. Now that's content deployment. Here's an example of moving from authoring to production. And again, it's just a more complex type of environment. But what I want to talk about, in addition to content deployment, is solution deployment. Anyone familiar with this? just 5 people tops, unless you guys just don't want to raise your hands at all. That's all right. Solution deployment is near and dear to my heart. I've spent no small amount of time for the past several years doing developer evangelism work. And yes, I do want to promote the use of SharePoint technology for custom development. But I do think that there needs to be a contract between development and IT, and that contract should be solutions. You need to make sure your developers don't create custom extensions for SharePoint technology that require manual installations. It's not the right thing to do. You can't manage it, and you shouldn't expect to have to do that. If they want to do that in their own dev environments, fine. But the unit of deployment is not a set of ASP.NET assets. The unit of deployment needs to be a solution package. It has an extension of WSP, but it's just a cab file. You can deploy it in one step with STS-ADM. You can, I'm sorry, not deploy it, you can add it to a farm using STS-ADM, and then the package lives in the config database. You can deploy from the config database to individual web applications in one operation from the command line or from within SharePoint Central Administration. When you add a new web front end to a farm, it'll automatically deploy all previously deployed solution packages to it. And if that involves some deployment time execution of putting things in the right places in the web front-end environment, that's fine. These things consist of a manifest.xml file, and it contains feature code, could contain list definitions, site definitions, all sorts of things. In fact, tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to do a very quick demo that shows what I mean by solution deployment. I see that we have a limited amount of time remaining, almost none. So, in fact, I'm betting that that is, oh no, that's somebody's phone ringing, not saying that time's up. But I will take this. How about, okay, yeah, here's a good component. This is rad editor moss.wsp. Oh yes, thank you. This is a WSP file. I've made a copy of it and given it a cab extension. There's a lot of stuff in here. The thing I want you to see, however, is the contents of manifest.xml. Let's just put it here on my desktop. In fact, let's do this. Come back here. That wasn't it. Here we go. Manifest.xml looks, yep, save it. Save it fast. There. So we contain inside of this solution some assemblies, some entries that go into the safe controls list inside of web.config. There are deployment targets for different safe controls. We've got class resources that need to be copied into the correct locations. We've actually got quite a lot of resources here. Some of them refer to features, some of them refer to controls, some of them refer to modifications or custom master pages or what have you. But suffice to say, there's a lot of information here. But the point here is, and the reason I bring this up, as far as you're concerned, it's just a WSP file. What you would do is come here to the operations in Central Admin, and you'd run solution management, and I've got 2 solutions that have already been added to the farm. One has been globally deployed, one here called rad editor for MOS. It's been, I can retract it from here, I can deploy it to web applications that don't have it yet. So I can deploy the solution now or at a specific time. I can deploy it to specific locations or specific web apps and so on. How do I get the WSP in here in the first place? It's an STS-ADM command. The action is add solution, and then you provide the file name to it. You can actually deploy with the command line as well, but you can deploy from here. So if there's a solution package, that's actually a really good way to go about it. This is the contract between your universe and ours. It's absolutely worth it. Insist that your developers do this. All right. A couple of final things. Protocols, they're all HTTP based. Here are firewall ports that are worth taking a look at. Lock everything down but that. I already mentioned what the zones are. I already mentioned that authentication comes from ASP.NET. Authorization is what we do, however. So we'll take whatever we've been provided by the ASP.NET or native Windows method, and we'll apply things. We use ACLs to lock down everything. Site collections, sites, list items, so on and so forth. And enable client integration, that's the thing where you can lobotomize, by turning this off, you can lobotomize the user interface so that it doesn't invoke smart clients if you can't use persistent cookies. Cache, this is the last thing I wanted to talk about very quickly. There are 3 kinds of caching, and they matter a lot. There is output caching. You can get to this within a particular site collection and individual sites. Output caching, it's great for pages, for heavily accessed websites that don't need to present new content frequently. Very, very good for that. The other thing would be object caching. And the thing that object caching is particularly handy for would be things like the content query web part or settings on different web parts. The key here is, how can I best put this? All the settings around a piece of running code, all the parameters and so on, that's what you want object caching to take care of. And you set a particular timeout on it, and we won't need to go back to the content database in order to retrieve them until the last possible second. Disk-based caching for binary large objects. This is the thing not a lot of people know about because it requires an edit to web.config in order to make it work. I love this. Any asset like JavaScript files or master page files or ASP.NET files that resides inside of the database. Remember, IIS will cache blobs all by itself if they're kept in the file system. This allows us to use a disk-based cache to cache application assets that are kept inside of the content database. So if you've been editing pages in SharePoint Designer and the entire page lives inside the database, no problem. We'll retrieve it, and for the duration of the cache, we'll go ahead and just serve things right out of the cache every time. Again, sticky sessions help with this too. But it's a really good idea to turn this on. If you just do a quick search on Microsoft.com for blob cache, you'll find it. We have different cache config levels for output caching. It's ASP.NET output caching, but we create profiles that make it easier for you to just say, for anonymous users, use this cache profile. For non-anonymous users, use that cache profile, that kind of thing. Fine-tune this. Definitely turn on performance monitoring and look at the cache hit ratio. When it gets to about 90% and you're not swapping out very often, you've optimized. Never cache search results if you want them to be security trimmed, and never cache personalized web parts if you want them to actually respect personalization. So, summary, pay attention to all of this, look at more of it. We actually augment our documentation and provide a lot of this advice within our blogs. Definitely take a look at this stuff. If you have questions, I'll answer them up here. I know we're out of time, but I'm also at the booth the entire afternoon, so as are plenty of other very smart SharePoint people. We'd love to take your questions. Come to the booth and bend our ear, and we'll do whatever we can to help you for as long as we possibly can. Don't delay. These are SharePoint training exams. We have exams and for both IT pros and developers. We also have courses that match these exams. We also have a lot of good related content here. There are lots of good resources on TechNet and Microsoft.com, and even on MSDN. We tend to do our blogs there. I don't know why, but they're on blogs.msdn.com instead of blogs.technet.com. Please complete an evaluation, and with that, I thank you for your time.